Welcome to this new series of food systems podcasts from the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, talking about all things to do with a more resilient and sustainable food and agriculture system, which can also provide the climate solutions that we need. My name is Mark Titterington, and I will be your host for today's episode and indeed all forthcoming episodes in this series. We start today with a man who has probably forgotten more about agriculture policy than the rest of us will know in our lifetimes. He is, of course, Tassos Haniotis, former Director of Strategy and Policy at the European Commission's DG Agriculture. And Tassos, I know over the last couple of months since you stepped out and retired from the Commission, you've been doing a lot of reflection. You had a presentation at the BLED Strategic Forum. You've posted a paper on LinkedIn looking at the food system and some of the challenges and opportunities perhaps that you see in that. I want to start by asking you, Tassos, in particular about Ukraine and the extent to which that conflict, and indeed others, has brought into focus and, I think as you've said, indeed accentuated some of the uncertainties that have impacted on agriculture markets since the late 2010s. What do you see those uncertainties are, and what do you think the impact has been?
First of all, thanks, Mark, for giving me the opportunity, in a sense, to continue things that I was doing before, and actually put more accent to the need to address simultaneously both the climate change and the food security challenges. In fact, if one looks at yesterday's agricultural outlook just put out by my former colleagues in DG AGRI, we see very clearly the combined impact of bad weather and the drought that we had in Europe, and also what the war in Ukraine has done in agricultural markets. But these were not the only reasons that we had where we had. If we go back to last summer, the summer of 21, we were coming out of COVID and the economic crisis that it created in many parts of the world in a manner that was asymmetric. And that generated upward pressures in prices, whether it was energy, metals, and minerals, and to some extent to agriculture. And what happened with the war in Ukraine is that all of these tensions that were there really increased much more for three reasons that are interrelated, if you want. First of all, there is a very big uncertainty about where in the short and medium term agricultural markets are going to stabilize. This has a lot to do with the fact that Russia and Ukraine combined are major players, not just in some agricultural markets, but especially in wheat, which is so strategic for food security. The second reason has to do with the energy link of the war in Ukraine, and also with the provision up until recently, and a very significant decline since the war, of energy coming from Russia, whether in the form of natural gas, which has the biggest impact, or in the form of crude oil. And third, what a war does is it makes people rethink the types of friendships, alliances, and overall relations they have in international relations. So what we have is three particular areas: agricultural markets, energy markets, and overall trade and relations, which generates all three an upward pressure on prices. And this, to some extent, I wouldn't call it a price premium because premium has a positive connotation, but there is a potential price top up that could stay in the foreseeable future in these markets. And this has an impact both in terms of the debate and the policy choices we have to make on climate action, and in terms of the debate and the policy choices in terms of food security.
Let's explore that a little bit further, Tassos. You talked, particularly in the LinkedIn paper, about false dilemmas, and you touched on at least one of them there in terms of the policy choices that we have to make. The first one is this tension between food security and climate action. Do you think, as a consequence of those three interrelated uncertainties that you talked about earlier, that those tensions between food security and climate action become greater and harder to resolve? Or is indeed it a false dilemma?
Well, I think we need to draw a distinction between tensions and dilemmas, because tensions exist and we need to recognize them. The dilemma is created when we have the tendency to believe that it's either or.
Mm.
I tried to put it more bluntly in a couple of speeches in the past, that is like choosing between your stomach or your lungs. Some people told me, but why do you link climate change with lungs? Well, we just saw what happened with the fires and the weather, the heat in the summer, to have this sense. And we also know what is happening in people's stomach where there is a food security issue. Now, if we have to address these tensions, we have to see how and where we can bring together the action for climate change and the action for food security. And I will start with the food security issue first, because that's where I think we have some of the misconceptions. Food security is something that people feel not when we look for new definitions of food security, but when we look about what the existing definition is telling us. Food security it is about food availability and food affordability. It's about the stomach and the pocket. And in both, we do have a serious problem this year. There are more and more people around the world that do have a problem of access to food. And there is a very significant problem of affordability to food, even in those parts of the world that produce food. So we have to recognize that there is a real worry in the average citizen right now about food security concerns. And especially this is even bigger in the developing world, but it is becoming also an issue in our part of the world. Does this mean that because we need to produce more and make food cheaper, that we're going to hurt actions on climate change? That's where I believe we are about sometimes to raise false dilemmas. Because the way to actually be able to produce more does not mean that this has to be done in a manner that is less sustainable than today. On the contrary, it means that it has to be done in a manner that is more sustainable than today. Now, in the manner by which I interpret things, and I'm pretty sure not everybody sees it the same way, but I'm an economist by training, what we have to do is look at what is actually affecting the marginal cost of producing food. Part of it is the fact that we have to take measures that are more friendly to the environment and cost more. Part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of factors that affect the cost of production in agriculture right now are exogenous to agriculture, and we don't have the policy tools to address them. Well, both of them indicate to me one thing: we have to increase productivity. And increasing productivity does not mean repeating the mistakes of the past and focusing only on the economic efficiency of what we do. It means combining together economic and environmental efficiency. And if we want to look not at some theoretical debate on the seventh cloud of theoretical abstraction, but what is really happening on the ground, we're going to see that there are practices throughout the full spectrum, from organic and agroecology to precision farming, that demonstrate exactly this: that we can increase economic and environmental efficiency at the same time. But where we have failed is in linking these experiences together and better communicating this.
The communication point is an interesting one, Tassos, because when you explain that as clearly and articulately as you do, it seems obvious, and yet that point doesn't land with all stakeholders. Some see um, environmental protection as being a cost on their business, particularly for some in the farming community, while those in the environmental organizations would argue that the drive for productivity undermines the environment. And yet, you've just made a very clear case there that these two things go together. Where are we failing, in your view?
I've pointed to this failure in the past also several times. I think it has to do with the fact that unlike what people in my generation used to do, where we used to dirty our hands with data and analysis of data before we moved in debating policy options, sometimes nowadays we start with policy options, idealizing the pros and minimizing the cons of these options without really looking at the underlying evidence. And I will bring you an example of what my former colleagues, and it sounds strange to talk about former, but anyway, the former colleagues in the Joint Research Center have done in helping for the preparation of the strategic plans of the member states. They did a very thorough literature review of best practices and made it available to member states. And I think it's also available to the wider public right now. And what we get out of this? What we get out of this is that the same practice has very different impacts depending on the soil condition, on the overall environment, on the management skill of farmers, on the presence or absence of a farm advisory system. So if we failed really to communicate, is because in our policy debate, our starting point has not been to identify what is the problem, what are the potential options, and weigh the pros and cons and try to find a combination of economic, environmental, and social aspects of sustainability, which, by the way, the weight we should put is going to be very different in different regions, even within a member state, let alone across member states. But we started with general ideas that thought we considered as being applicable everywhere in the same way. And that, in my view, had distorted the debate for quite some time, especially in terms of the potential policy options we could have.
Without wishing to lead you in any way, Tassos, I mean, in the LinkedIn paper that you published, you argued that environmental problems are a failure of both public policies as well as private markets. Is that what you're driving at in your previous response? And would you elaborate on that in any way?
Yeah, it's exactly that. In fact, I believe that markets provide extremely important signals that we should not ignore. But markets are not perfect. They have their failures, and one of the biggest failures I have had over the years is exactly inaccurately reflecting the environmental footprint of our practices. And that's not an agricultural issue, it's an issue that affects all human activities, from the most basic needs we have in food, in energy, in shelter, and in transport, to the luxury items of our behavior. The way to address this failure is by having policies that actually try to correct market failures. Now, if public policies had been successful in doing that, then we wouldn't be debating about the environmental problems we face today, because we would have solved with public policies these problems. So there is an issue there, both in terms of how markets fail to accurately reflect in their price mechanism what is really happening throughout the sustainability aspects of our behavior. But we also have to look at what our policies have done and have not done so far. But again, we shouldn't minimize and oversimplify the debate. I mean, our starting point should be that when it comes to European agriculture, and also when it comes to European transport and many other aspects of our industry, Europe has done very significant steps in reducing emissions. We're not where we want to be, and we have to do much more. But what have we learned from what we have done so far? Now, if we minimize the progress we have made, we will not even derive the most appropriate lesson. So, and I think that has partly to do with the fact that if you look at the political spectrum, when you have opinions that consider that everything that is private is the big driver of what we have to do, and we should leave the public out. to the other extreme that it's only through the public policies that we have to actually solve the problems, and the private is a failure. I believe that we need both, and we need to combine both, and we need to be very clear about what the private and the public sector can do in synergies, but also where there are some tensions that have to be addressed.
Let me just take you another dimension of that, if I may, Tassos. The challenge of food security, the challenge of environmental security, the challenge of climate action. These are global problems. Often we look for local solutions within those. Um, in your view, are local solutions necessary, but are they likely to be sufficient to tackle the challenges that we face, which are certainly regional and almost definitely global?
Uh, you put it more correctly, maybe, than when I put it in the linked in item. They're necessary but not sufficient. I mean, to me, it's evident that we need to focus more on local solutions because part of what they do is they reintroduced an element of diversity that we're about to lose, not only in biodiversity but also cultural diversity, other aspects that are pretty necessary. But we shouldn't expect miracles. It's one thing to focus on a local solution where you have a big city with a strong demand, let's say for organic products, or where you have the infrastructure that allows short supply chains to develop. And it's a completely different thing to look for a local solution in areas of the world, and I'm not only talking about Europe here or the European Union, where you do have a very significant food deficit. My starting point is that both climate change and also food security are global problems. And we need to see the big picture when we try to apply also the local solutions. And I think this is extremely important because one of the mistakes we often do is that we say we don't have a food security problem in the European Union. What we should say is actually we don't have a food deficit problem in the European solution. There is no food security issue at the level of a region. It's a global issue. Because if you have a very significant deficit in some parts of the world, you're going to feel it in all parts of the world through the price mechanism and the trade flows. And if we look at developments in Africa and in parts of Asia, we very clearly see that we do have a very significant increase in food deficits in parts of the world, and that has to be addressed at the global level with combined efforts. And we should be very clearly aware of what are the possibilities and the very significant benefits we can get with certain local solutions, but what are the limitations of only local solutions approach.
Tassos, I want to bring us towards the end of this discussion now and maybe take us back to where you began at the beginning with the uncertainties caused by the conflict in Ukraine, the rising energy prices, the rethinking of some of the relationships and partnerships that the world has in many ways depended on in the post-war period. Um, you've got extensive experience over 30 years of working in the European Commission. When you stand back and you look at those uncertainties, when you look at the dilemmas that we've been discussing this morning, what gives you the biggest cause for concern out of them all in terms of achieving a more resilient and sustainable food and agriculture system? And to perhaps finish on a positive note, if that's possible, where do you see the biggest cause for optimism?
I would say clearly that the biggest concern I have is that we have war in on European soil. I mean, throughout my career and my life, there has been war in many parts of the world. Sometimes exactly because it was not that close to our neighborhood. Although being Greek, there has always been something close to my home neighborhood. I mean, we had the tendency to underestimate maybe the suffering of others. What this war, and especially the cynicism and the brutality of this war, has brought to us so closely, especially because of the manner by which social media communicate everything that is happening directly right now, is something that changes completely the fundamental basis of what we assumed. I mean, it's one thing to talk about, we use the term war for trade conflicts and tensions among major partners for trivial issues. What we have here is massive loss of human life, destruction of infrastructure, uncertainty about where people are going to go. You look into agricultural situation in Ukraine. I mean, what will happen in the harvest in the areas now that there is bombing? What will happen in planting? What is happening in the fertilizer markets? What will happen next year, which might even be more challenging than this year? This is the biggest concern, because all the fundamental elements and aspects that we took for granted in the post-war situation, including the respect of frontiers and of international rules, have been very severely challenged. And this requires a very firm, a very clear answer that is going to have certain costs in the short and medium term. But these are costs that we have to bear if we really want to make sure that the world tomorrow, after the situation, is safer. So that's the big concern. Now, on the optimistic side, if you want, and the positive side, it is with crises like that that you also see not only the ugly, but the positive face of human behavior. The manner by which people generate more solidarity among themselves, the manner by which they innovate, the manner by which, when faced with this dilemma, death or life, they massively, although unfortunately don't uniformly, go for life. And also, there is another element that this situation is doing. It brings into the forefront the need to address climate and food security in a manner that is potentially complementary. And that's where I hope to be able to continue, putting my energy in the years to come.
Well, Tassos, we hope that as well. Your experience is invaluable in these challenging times. Very much appreciate you spending time with us this morning and joining this first episode of the new series of Food Systems podcast. We wish you every success. Thank you indeed for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on the next edition of the Food Systems podcast from the Forum for the Future of Agriculture.